Behind the high walls of Spanish palaces, in the deep shadows of gilded thrones, lay a secret whispered by courtiers only in the darkest of corners. This was not a secret of treason or forbidden love, but of an anomaly locked within the body of a single man, the king. This peculiarity was so monstrous that it turned the marriage bed into a scaffold and wedding vows into a near-certain death sentence. The monarch's name was Ferdinand VII, but history remembers him not as a ruler, but as a living curse upon the 4 women who dared to share his crown and his bed, and whose lives were cut short in the prime of their youth. Do you think you know all there is to know about cruel monarchs and their unfortunate queens? Forget the dry lines of history books and the grand portraits by Goya, which conceal an unsightly truth behind layers of flattery and oil. We will take you behind the curtain of the official chronicle into the suffocating royal chambers where the true dramas unfolded. Dramas full of pain, despair, and incredible female fortitude. You will learn how ignorance, cultivated by religious tutors, transformed a wedding night into a theater of the absurd. You will witness the desperate humiliation a second queen endured to please her husband. And finally, you will understand what cleverness, what simple, almost ingenious invention allowed the 4th wife not only to survive, but to change the course of history. This is a tale not of politics, but of a carnal horror locked away in the kingdom's master bedroom. The truth, hidden for centuries, will today be revealed. To understand the scale of the tragedy that will unfold in this story, we must first look closely at its architect. Not the ceremonial image of the monarch, but the man of flesh and blood, whose body and soul were a battlefield for the most bizarre contradictions. Born on October 14, 1784, Infante Ferdinand seemed from his first days a mockery of the majestic title Prince of Asturias. He grew into a sickly, corpulent child, his body seemingly preparing itself in advance to house all the vices he was destined to cultivate. His passion was food, greasy, abundant, and coarse, much like the people with whom he would later surround himself. From a young age, his lungs were steeped in the smoke of endless cigars, which gave his voice an unpleasant, grating quality, and his face an unhealthy pallor. His contemporaries, mincing no words, described him as an almost repulsive figure, a heavy, flabby build, empty and expressionless eyes, and a perpetual causeless smirk frozen on his full lips. But the true horror was not hidden in his unattractive appearance. Ferdinand's soul was a far uglier creation. Historians are unanimous in their assessments. He was a cowardly man, pathologically duplicitous, and utterly indifferent to the fate of his country. His reign would enter the annals of Spanish history as the ominous decade, an era of repression, betrayal, and a regression to the darkest days of the Inquisition. He sent to the gallows with ease the very men who had fought for his return to the throne, and he took pleasure in surrounding himself with sycophants and scoundrels. Intellectuals, enlightened nobles, war heroes, they all provoked in him a dull irritation, as if their brilliance only highlighted his own mental and spiritual poverty. His court devolved into a circus, where the tone was set by former grooms and barbers, whose crude jokes and obscene manners were far more to the king's liking than refined conversations about politics or art. Many saw in this willing descent into vulgarity a defense mechanism of a man acutely aware of his own inadequacy. And yet, within this grim personality lurked a startling paradox, a key to understanding his strange nature. For all his cruelty, sloth, and lust, Ferdinand harbored a secret, almost unthinkable passion for a man of his character: embroidery. Yes, this portly, despotic monarch could sit for hours, bent over an embroidery hoop, meticulously crafting intricate patterns with gold and silk threads. His favorite pastime was decorating slippers and creating religious tapestries. Imagine the scene. The same hands that signed death warrants would, with a jeweler's precision, guide a needle to form the faces of saints. His masterpiece, of which he was particularly proud, was a scene of the Last Supper, embroidered on velvet. What was this? Sincere piety? An attempt to atone for his sins? Or perhaps the only sphere where this limited man could feel himself a sovereign creator, crafting his own obedient and perfect world, unlike the real one he despised and failed to understand. And against this backdrop was the central fatal feature of his nature, the detail that turned him into a monster of the bedchamber. Medicine gives this condition a dry name: macrogenitosomia. To put it plainly, his male member was twice the size of an ordinary man's. This was not a mark of virility, but a deformity, not a gift, but a curse that transformed intimacy into an ordeal and conjugal duty into torture. This physical anomaly, compounded by his ignorance and cruelty, became the hammer that would fall upon the heads of his young wives. He was a complex, repulsive, and deeply unhappy man, but his personal dramas inspired no sympathy, for their price was the lives of others. It was with this baggage, with the body of a giant, the mind of a child, and the soul of a tyrant, that Ferdinand VII prepared to enter his first marriage, a union that was doomed from the start to be a farce. In 1702, Madrid welcomed its future queen. 18-year-old Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, Ferdinand's first cousin, arrived in Spain, full of the hopes befitting her youth and station. She was not merely a princess, but a flower of the enlightened Neapolitan court. Intelligent, well-read, fluent in several languages, she had grown up in an atmosphere of art and intellectual discourse. The Spanish court, by contrast, struck her as suffocating, steeped in intrigue and ignorance. And her fiancé, whom she was meeting for the first time, was a profound shock. All the rumors that had reached Naples were but a pale shadow of the horrifying reality. Before her stood not a graceful prince, but a heavy, clumsy youth with a vacant gaze, whose bearing and speech betrayed an uneducated and coarse man. But duty was duty. Swallowing her disappointment, Maria Antonia stepped forward to meet her fate, not yet knowing she was entering not a marriage, but a torture chamber. The culmination of this theater of the absurd was their wedding night, a scene worthy of the most deranged playwright. When the heavy oak door of the royal bedchamber closed behind the last servant, leaving the young couple alone, a heavy silence fell. The young princess, blushing but ready to fulfill her dynastic mission, waited. But what happened next defied all reason. Instead of words of love or even awkward tenderness, Ferdinand began to emit strange guttural sounds, something between a growl and a squeal. He paced the room. Then, approaching his stunned wife, he buried his face in her chest like a lost infant and began to suckle loudly. And after this humiliating spectacle, something truly unimaginable occurred. Ferdinand pulled away, matter-of-factly took a small embroidery hoop and needle from his coat pocket, sat down in a chair, and immersed himself in his favorite pastime. Maria Antonia was left alone on the vast marriage bed, watching as her husband, the heir to a great empire, focused intently on adding another silk stitch to his slippers. Later, in conversation with a trusted valet, Ferdinand offered a pathetic and ludicrous explanation for his behavior. It turned out that his fanatical monastic tutors had so terrified the Infante with tales of carnal sin that he genuinely believed a single touch of a woman's skin could strike him blind. This infantile fear, planted in the mind of the heir to the throne, had turned the first night into a farce, and the subsequent months into a continuous humiliation for his wife. Her mother, the powerful and perceptive Queen Maria Carolina of Naples, did not restrain her fury upon receiving her daughter's letters. In her correspondence with a friend, she gave her son-in-law a devastating character assessment that speaks more eloquently than any historical treatise. The Prince of Asturias is a total disappointment. His face is repulsive, his build heavy, and his legs and knees are so round they resemble a child's. His voice is thin and disagreeably shrill. He is also mentally deficient, a complete imbecile. Although he is physically sound, after a full week of married life, they have yet to become true husband and wife. He is unpleasant, uninteresting, lazy, utterly ignorant, and possesses a disgusting habit of giggling constantly for no reason. 7 long months of this humiliating inaction passed before the scandal reached Ferdinand's father, King Charles IV. The monarch, angered less by his daughter-in-law's humiliation than by the threat to the dynasty, intervened personally. A harsh conversation took place, during which the heir to the throne was finally enlightened in the clearest possible terms about the nature of his marital duties. And at that moment, the pendulum swung to the other, no less terrifying, extreme. From a frightened ignoramus who feared being blinded, Ferdinand transformed into a tireless, almost obsessive husband. For the fragile Maria Antonia, the period of cold neglect was over, and a nightmare of physical coercion began. Her body, unprepared for his crudeness and, above all, for his anatomical anomaly, became the field for his newfound instincts. In 3 years of this agonizing union, she suffered 2 miscarriages, each one robbing her not only of the hope for an heir, but also of her vital strength. Her health withered before everyone's eyes. In 1706, at the age of just 21, Ferdinand's first wife passed away. The official cause of death was tuberculosis, but at court there were persistent whispers of something else. It was said that her decline was aided by her mother-in-law, Queen Maria Louisa, who despised her intelligent and educated daughter-in-law. Poison or disease, we will never know. But the first act of the drama had been played, and the stage was already being set for the next victim. Я готов продолжить, как только вы дадите сигнал. Пожалуйста, оцените стилистику, тон и адаптацию. Part 2. English translation. 10 years passed. A decade during which Ferdinand VII went from an exiled infante to an absolute monarch, having reclaimed his throne after the Napoleonic Wars. But the throne remained precarious without its most crucial element, an heir. And so, the conveyor belt of dynastic marriages was set in motion once more. The new choice, or rather, the new victim, was his own niece, the Portuguese princess Maria Isabella of Braganza. When she arrived in Madrid in 1816, the court, holding its breath, began to assess her chances. She possessed neither the refined intellect of the first Maria Antonia nor her fragile beauty. Contemporaries described her as a rather plain-looking young woman, short, plump, with large, slightly protruding eyes. But in those eyes burned not only fear of the unknown, but also a firm resolve. She knew of her predecessor's fate and understood that her task was not merely to become queen, but to survive in a cage with a very dangerous and unpredictable beast. Maria Isabella chose a tactic that was staggering in its audacity and desperation. She did not fight her husband's vices. She decided to play along with them, transforming her life into a perpetual masquerade. Rumors had reached her, rumors that were, in truth, an open secret throughout Madrid. King Ferdinand was a frequent visitor to the city's most squalid districts. He was drawn to crude, vulgar pleasures, to women from the city's outskirts whose behavior and manners excited him far more than aristocratic restraint. And so, the Queen of Spain did the unthinkable. She began to study the mannerisms of the inhabitants of the very establishments her husband frequented. This was not a game. It was a desperate wager in the battle for her husband's favor and her own life. The palace became her stage, and she the leading actress. In the morning, as the king descended the grand marble staircase, she would greet him in character. Gaudy outfits, overly bright cosmetics, a provocative posture, a sultry or conversely, a defiant gaze. She copied everything she believed might attract Ferdinand. This daily spectacle reached its absurd peak when it was discovered that the costumes for these performances were made by the same dressmakers who served Madrid's brothels. The royal wardrobe was soon filled with cheap lace, vulgar corsets, and stockings that would have been appropriate anywhere but in the chambers of a monarch. One can only imagine the shock of the court ladies as they watched their queen, the heir of an ancient lineage, transform into a parody of a streetwalker. But the strategy, however humiliating, worked. Ferdinand was aroused. In this masquerade, he saw not the degradation of the crown, but a reflection of his own secret desires. For a time, a passion ignited in the marriage, albeit one founded on this strange, almost perverse ritual. Soon, Maria Isabella became pregnant, and it seemed her sacrifice had not been in vain. She gave the king a daughter, but the curse of the House of Bourbon was not dormant. The infant lived for only 4 months, leaving behind only emptiness and a renewed urgent need for an heir. Hope flared again when the queen conceived for a second time. But this pregnancy was difficult. In December 1818, she went into labor, a labor that quickly turned into a nightmare. After many hours of agony, Maria Isabella lost consciousness. The court physicians gathered at her bedside, frantically trying to find a pulse. There was none. They could detect no breath. In the chaos and fear of the king's wrath, for he stood to lose both his wife and his child, a terrible verdict was delivered. The queen had expired, but the child, they reasoned, might still be alive and must be saved. The decision was made to perform a cesarean section, a desperate and at the time barbaric operation, performed on a body they believed to be lifeless. And in the moment the cold steel of the scalpel touched her flesh, the most horrific thing imaginable happened. From the unbearable pain, Maria Isabella awoke. A single, piercing scream erupted from her throat, a cry of horror, betrayal, and agony. And then, just as suddenly, all was silent. This time, forever. The child, when extracted from her body, was also dead. Ferdinand's second queen, like his first, was just 21 years old. The tragic pattern had repeated itself with terrifying precision, and the throne was once again vacant. Готов к следующей части. Part 3. English translation. Less than a year passed after the second tragedy, which had shaken even the hardened Spanish court. Ferdinand VII was now 35, and the question of an heir was more urgent than ever. His personal appetites and the needs of the state were once again tangled in a tight knot that demanded an immediate solution. Another casting call for European princesses began, and this time the choice fell upon distant Saxony. The new bride was Maria Josepha Amalia, a young princess who had barely turned 16 at the time of her wedding. When she arrived in Madrid, the court breathed a sigh of relief. Unlike her two predecessors, she was pretty and as fresh as a flower bud yet to bloom. Her gentle gaze, soft voice, and pronounced piety seemed to be exactly what the scandal-weary court and the aging king needed. Ferdinand was charmed. He saw in her not a person, but pliable material, a blank slate upon which he could write whatever he pleased. He mistook her docile nature for a guarantee of future tranquility, and perhaps, for the first time in years, felt something akin to tenderness. However, the very qualities that had so captivated the king, her youth, her naivety, and her deep religiosity, became the detonator for the next catastrophe. Maria Josepha had been raised under the strictest rules of a Catholic convent, where the world beyond its walls was presented to her as a place of sin and peril. Of the physical side of marriage, she had not the slightest idea. For her, matrimony was a spiritual union, a sacrament. All matters of the flesh remained a dark, forbidden, and terrifying territory. And so, their wedding night arrived. One can only imagine the dread this young woman experienced, taken from the quiet of her sheltered life and placed in the home of a 40-year-old heavyset and impatient man. Historical chronicles have preserved for us only fragmented, yet profoundly eloquent, accounts of that night. According to one version, Ferdinand, unburdened by preludes or tender words, appeared before his young wife in a state of nature, ready to proceed immediately with his conjugal duty. Maria Josepha's reaction was predictable. What she saw was not a display of marital intimacy, but the appearance of a monster. Her mind, nurtured on the lives of saints and prayers, could not accommodate this crude, animalistic reality. And when her gaze fell upon the king's notorious anatomical feature, which was not merely large but abnormally, frighteningly immense, her childlike mind broke. She saw in him not just a man, but something diabolical, a perversion of divine design. With a wild cry of, "That is not a man, it is a monster!" she leaped from the bed and fled the chamber in a panic. Court chroniclers add one humiliating detail. In a fit of uncontrollable terror, the young queen supposedly soiled herself, utterly destroying any chance of intimacy that night. The incident was not merely a failure. It was a brand that scarred their marriage from its very first hours. A relationship that began with such a shock was doomed. This union proved to be the shortest and most barren of them all. For 10 years, Maria Josepha lived in a gilded cage, remaining for Ferdinand more a symbol of his latest failure than a true wife. She was never able to overcome her initial terror, and the king, for his part, possessed neither the tact nor the patience to help her do so. Physical intimacy, if it ever occurred, was an agony for her, one that slowly but surely eroded her fragile health. She faded quietly, imperceptibly, like a flower that could never blossom in the poisonous atmosphere of that court. Historians have left us no detailed accounts of her final days. Her passing was not accompanied by loud scandals or court intrigues. She simply vanished, adding her name to the sad list of victims. Her short life became one more piece of evidence, the most concise but no less tragic, of a terrible pattern. To become the wife of Ferdinand VII was to receive a one-way ticket to the grave. The royal throne was empty for a third time, and now time was working against the monarch himself. Готов к четвертой, финальной части. Part 4. English translation. The year was 1829. Ferdinand VII was now 45, a considerable age by the standards of the time. His body, tormented by gout, obesity, and a lifetime of excess, was rapidly failing, and Spain was still without an heir to the throne, a situation that threatened the country with another civil war upon the king's death. 3 marriages, 3 young lives cut down in their prime, and not a single surviving male child. It seemed as if not just a curse, but a final judgment hung over the king and his throne. But Ferdinand was not one to give up, especially when it came to continuing his line. For a 4th and final time, he decided to try his luck. His choice once again fell upon a close relative, the 23-year-old Neapolitan princess Maria Cristina de Bourbon, who, by a twist of fate, was also his niece. When news of the new marriage spread across Europe, many simply shook their heads in sympathy. Everyone knew the fate that had befallen her predecessors, and few believed this southern beauty could alter what seemed preordained. But they underestimated Maria Cristina. She was not traveling to Madrid as a lamb to the slaughter. She was coming to conquer. Maria Cristina was the complete opposite of the king's previous wives. She possessed neither the intellect of the first, the desperate submissiveness of the second, nor the convent-bred naivety of the third. Instead, she had what they all so desperately lacked: a sober, pragmatic mind, an iron will, and astonishing common sense. She was fully aware of all the sordid and tragic details of her future husband's private life. And rather than panicking or leaving things to chance, she took action. Even before the wedding, using her channels at court, she gathered all possible information about the king's central problem. And she understood immediately, to survive and fulfill her mission to bear an heir, she could not simply endure or adapt. She needed an engineering solution, and she found one. It was a step no queen before her had dared to take. She transformed an intimate problem into a medical one and demanded it be solved. Immediately upon her arrival in Madrid, before the first wedding night, Maria Cristina convened a council of her most trusted court physicians, midwives, and even tailors. Without false modesty or aristocratic pretense, she laid out the problem. She had no intention of suffering like her predecessors, nor would she risk her health and the life of her future child. She needed a protective device. The idea was simple but brilliant: to create a special cushion that would soften the physical pressure and minimize the consequences of her husband's anatomical anomaly. This was an unprecedented moment in the history of royal courts. A whole team worked on the creation of this seemingly simple object. Jewelers designed an elegant lacquered box for it, adorned with the royal crest, to give the invention a proper status. Tailors and midwives selected the materials, ultimately settling on the softest kidskin leather and silk, filled with a resilient yet pliable material. This was not just a cushion, it was her shield, her armor, in the most intimate of all possible battles. And that shield worked. The simple invention proved to be astonishingly effective. Maria Cristina not only escaped the tragic fate of her predecessors, she succeeded where they had failed. She not only remained alive and healthy, but she also gave the crown what it had been waiting for. First came the Infanta Isabella, the future Queen Isabella II, and then her sister, Luisa Fernanda. The curse was broken. Later, in her personal diaries, which miraculously survived to this day, Maria Cristina would bluntly refer to the cushion as "my salvation." She also added a mundane but very telling detail. The device had to be replaced every week because the fabric could not withstand the pressure and would tear. This small detail speaks volumes about the danger from which she had protected herself. 4 years later, in 1833, Ferdinand VII, finally consumed by his ailments, departed this world. It is said his young widow did not grieve excessively. She had fulfilled her duty, secured the future of the dynasty, and most importantly, she had survived. And just 3 months after the official period of mourning, she secretly married a man who was the polar opposite of the late king. His name was Fernando Muñoz, and he was a common sergeant from her personal guard, a young, swarthy, physically robust man of a lower class. In this secret but happy marriage, she would bear 7 more children. Thus, the clever and pragmatic Neapolitan princess not only broke a deadly pattern, but also, after biding her time, found the simple human happiness her predecessors could only dream of. She closed the final chapter of this dark history, proving that sometimes to defeat a monster, you don't need a sword, but intelligence, ingenuity, and one very well-designed cushion. So ends the story of a king whose body became a prison for himself and a deadly trap for his wives. But it would be too simplistic to blame 4 ruined young lives on a single anatomical anomaly. This physical peculiarity of Ferdinand VII was not so much the cause of the tragedies as their ugliest and most visible symbol. It became a sinister metaphor for the entire rotten system in which the European aristocracy had lived for centuries. Remember, all 4 of his wives were his close relatives, first cousins and nieces. Centuries of inbreeding, intended to preserve the purity of blue blood and keep power within the family, in reality led to dynastic decay. Stillborn children, painful miscarriages, genetic defects, and the general frailty of offspring. This was the true price of dynastic marriages. The king's physical imperfection was but one of the many monsters born from the sleep of reason and political expediency. Art, as is often the case, served as a screen to hide this unsightly truth. The great Francisco Goya, the court painter, created a whole gallery of portraits of Ferdinand and his family. But look at them. From the canvases, majestic, if unattractive, monarchs gaze back at us. The artist, known for his ruthless honesty, in this case chose flattery. He depicted none of the king's physical peculiarities, not a single hint of the secret that was destroying lives. However, as one court legend has it, the truth did try to seep out. It is said that one of Goya's students, who had the rare opportunity to see the monarch unclothed, secretly made a life sketch. This drawing was so shockingly explicit that as soon as its existence became known, it was immediately confiscated and destroyed by personal order from the royal palace. The powers that be did everything to erase any evidence from history, leaving us with only rumors and ceremonial portraits. With Ferdinand's passing, this volatile mix of palace intrigue, scandal, and amoral liaisons did not disappear. On the contrary, it only gained momentum. The regency of his widow, Maria Cristina, followed by the tumultuous, love affair-filled reign of their daughter, Queen Isabella II, would give Spain many more scandalous sagas. The House of Bourbon continued to live by its own rules, where personal passions and state duty were twisted into a knot so tight and so perverse that it was impossible to untangle. The history of this family proves that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not found in fairy tales, but in royal bedchambers. And the deepest wounds on the body of a nation are inflicted not by wars, but by the secrets hidden behind velvet curtains. But those are entirely different stories, each deserving of its own telling. Перевод завершен. Я стремился сохранить баланс между исторической точностью, драматизмом повествования и культурной адаптацией для англоязычного читателя, следуя всем вашим указаниям.